Good evening. Welcome to the Oak Creek Flood Mapping Study Virtual Flood Risk Open House. My name is Lynn Whitman. I am the Director of the Yavapai County Flood Control District. Some of you may have gone to a meeting 4 years ago for the Oak Creek Flood Mapping Study. We had several of them throughout the county. This is that same study. We're at the next phase now. If we could go to the agenda. Thank you. We have several experts here tonight to help us get through quite a bit of information. The FEMA risk map overview is going to be handled by Michael Bishop from FEMA Region 9. He'll be talking about the project from the FEMA perspective. And then Linda Potter from Atkins will be talking about the study itself, the history, where we are, what the study means for everybody. And then the effects of map changes on flood insurance will be presented by Bruce Bender with Bender Consulting Services. He's a national insurance specialist and will be able to answer a lot of flood insurance specific questions. It'll come back to me to talk about the effects of the map changes on building requirements, how that will affect any permits that you have or new things that you want to build on your property. Bruce will talk about options if you disagree with the preliminary flood maps. We are entering a 90-day appeal period 1 week from today on the 29th. So from the end of September until the end of December, that will be the time for anyone to come forward with an appeal request. I'll cover next steps and resources, and then we will have time at the end for questions and answers. If you see you've got the question box over to the right, you can start filling in questions as you think of them, and then we will go through them at the end. But before we get started with all of that, Linda is going to go over how to navigate the webinar.
Great, thank you. We appreciate your participation tonight. GoToWebinar is the platform that we are using for this presentation. So tips for navigating GoToWebinar. You'll see a control window on your on the left side of the screen. You can open this by clicking the orange arrow icon shown here. Please remember to mute your phones, and you'll have to type in any questions by clicking the drop-down arrow on the questions bar and type your questions in the text box. And as Lynn mentioned, we will be answering all your questions at the end, but feel free to type them in at any time. I'm going to turn it over to Michael Bishop with FEMA Region 9. He's going to do an overview of FEMA's risk map program.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Michael Bishop, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening to explain some national level context and then some FEMA region context that will describe where this study came from and what other work might also be associated with the great state of Arizona. You can go to the next slide, please. So this comes from one of FEMA's many programs. Some are for disaster and some are for non-disaster times. This is from the non-disaster list of programs that we have. It's called the Risk Map Program. MAP is an acronym. It stands for Mapping, Assessment, and Planning. And it's through this program that we get the funds to partner with Lynn Whitman at Yavapai County to do any flood insurance rate map update studies that we determine are necessary to be updated because of changing conditions, ground conditions, and or other things. So the purpose of the Risk Map program is to find where these studies need to be done, perform the studies, and through the studies and the hazards that are expressed, identify risks that are associated with the hazards, and then do something about them, quite frankly. And we do that through communication means such as this meeting and the previous meetings that Lynn had described earlier at the introduction, and there'll be some more meetings later on. But one of the most important overlaps for communication will be the appeal period that is coming up that Lynn described starting on September 29th. Let's go ahead on to the next slide, please. A little description, if I were to tell you that I work for FEMA Region 9, I can tell you that our office is in Oakland, but it covers a vast area. It's actually 4 states, Nevada, California, and Arizona, and the islands of Hawaii. And then there are 3 territories, which would be Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa. And so we cover all of those time zones, all of those lands, and we are responsible for providing flood hazard information for all of the people that reside in all of these locations. So right now, I can tell you that we have more than 125 projects that are ongoing, mapping projects. Of those, Arizona has 105 participating communities in the performance of these studies. And I'm sorry, it's in Arizona, there's 105 participating communities in the program, and reference to the program in this case would be the National Flood Insurance Program, which is the access to the risk map program. And then within Arizona, we have more than 30 ongoing mapping projects. So you can see where they are distributed across the state. There are more in ideation right now where we're preparing to do more. And then some of these, of course, are nearing the end and they'll drop off the list. So I think you can imagine that we're probably going to continue to carry somewhere on the order of 25 to 35 projects continuously across the state of Arizona. And we can go on to the next slide from here. And this is where I turn it back over to Linda Potter. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. So we're here to discuss the Oak Map Remapping Project. I'm with a consulting firm called Atkins based here in Arizona. We like to use a lot of acronyms when we talk, so I would like to define a few of these for you. So what is a flood map? Well, a flood map is going to show your flood risks. And we call these flood insurance rate maps, or FERMs is the acronym. These are created and maintained by FEMA and its partners, meaning our local communities. And there is no such thing as a no risk zone. There's always some risk of flooding on any property. And knowing what your flood risk is going to help you make sound decisions about protecting your property. And why do these flood maps matter? The community can use this to safely manage growth and development. It's also going to help you as a property owner make a more informed decision about your risk, and it's going to result in a safer and more resilient community. Why do these maps change? That's frankly because flood risks change over time. The current maps on the effective FERM panels are over 30 years old. And since that time, development has occurred. We also have additional years of rainfall and runoff data that can help us look at peak flow rates on a statistical basis. And we've seen a vast improvement in technology where we're able to look more closely and more accurately at the underlying terrain compared to what we expect the flooding to do. So the current flood maps are outdated, and new flood maps are going to provide us a better understanding of today's flood risk and help guide creating a safer and more resilient place to live and work. Some key terms: FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I already defined what the FERM is, which is the Flood Insurance Rate Map, and also the FIS is the flood insurance study that accompanies the maps. We may speak of SFHA, which is the Special Flood Hazard Area, and these are the higher risk zones that are shown on our FEMA FERM maps. A floodplain is a generic term we use that may be any land subject to flooding, and in this presentation we mean that these floodplains are mapped by FEMA. A base flood is the 1% annual chance of flooding, and the base flood elevation is the expected water surface elevation of that 1% annual chance flood. The letter of final determination, or LFD, this is a letter from FEMA that the new maps will be effective within the specified time frame. So let's look at a few of these on a map. The floodway is shown in the hatched area right here, and it's the portion of a floodplain that's preserved. So this is your main conveyance area. So allowing development in the other areas will allow this floodway to be open and convey the water. A high-risk flood zone is typically designated as a Zone A or a Zone AE, with Zone A being a more approximate study and Zone AE being a more detailed study. A moderate risk area is the shaded Zone X, which is a 0.2% annual chance of occurring. And low risk is generally defined as the areas outside of any of the special flood hazard areas. In cross-section, if you look at the definition of a floodway, if you allow encroachment to occur within the floodplain, you want to make sure that the floodway, which is the portion closest to the stream channel, is going to remain open for conveyance. And this is defined by equal conveyance encroachment calculations to determine where you can encroach on each side of the floodplain. For this particular study, we updated almost 150 miles of streams within Yavapai, Coconino, and the city of Sedona. And you can see these lines on the screen here as blue lines going up Oak Creek Canyon, all the way down Oak Creek to the confluence of the Verde River, and also studying some of the smaller tributaries and bigger tributaries such as Spring Creek and Dry Creek. How will the updated flood map affect you? When they're effective, these maps may influence future building, remodeling, and home purchase decisions. You may want to decide if you would like to carry flood insurance requirements and the costs of those policies. And FEMA has an insurance rating option to help reduce that financial impact, which Bruce is going to talk about in just a minute. So all new buildings and remodeling will need to be done in accordance with the new maps once they become effective. The study has had many partners over the past 4 years. Yavapai County Flood Control District was the lead agency partnering with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Also partners on this project are the City of Sedona, Coconino County Flood Control District, the engineers and scientists that prepared the study, the community organizations, residents and business owners, and also yourself. We have a lot more information so you can look specifically at your property and its flood risk. On the screen, you'll see a link to the project homepage. This is housed on Yavapai County's website, and there's a screen called Oak Creek Maps. And in here, there is a link to the Oak Creek Map Change Viewer, where you can add your address in or zoom to an area to look at your specific risk. So here's an example of what that map change viewer looks like. On one side of the screen, you have the older floodplain, meaning the effective one that's in effect right now. And then on the right-hand side is the proposed flood zones. So you can look at them side by side to figure out how your risks may have changed on your property. We are at the public comment period, as Lynn mentioned, is starting next week. Once the comment period has expired, which is 90 days, if no comments or appeals are received, the letter of final determination, or LFD, will be issued in the spring with the new maps effective expected in fall of 2022. I'm now going to turn it over to Bruce Bender, and he is going to talk about map changes on flood insurance.
Great, thank you very much. One of the things to consider, and two things to consider when the map changes occur is how does that affect the requirement for flood insurance, and how does that reflect building requirements? So in this next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about what the effects are on flood insurance, and then Lynn's going to follow up behind me to talk about what does that mean around building requirements. So let's take a look at the new rating program that FEMA has. because some of you may have understood or heard about what's called grandfathering and other type of ratings, but FEMA has totally changed how they're rating flood insurance starting October 1st. Next. And the existing policies that are out there now will be rated the old way as they renew up till April 1st of next year, and then they will be rated with this new rating option. Next. So what's different about this is that risk rating 2.0 is what it's called, risk rating 2.0 equity in action. And the equity is around making the rates more equitable to the risk. So bigger houses, more expensive homes have a higher risk with the same amount of inches of water than a smaller or less expensive home, for example. And the current program doesn't address that. How far you are from next slide. How far you are from a flooding source is not addressed in the current one, but in the new one it does. How high the first floor is above the ground is going to be important. And then if you take mitigation efforts such as flood vents, or like I said, elevating, or putting the machinery and equipment up a floor, those mitigation efforts provide discounts both not only in the high risk area, which currently some of them do, but also in those moderate and low risk areas. Next. And just the thing to point out is that if for policies that are renewing between that October 1st date and that March 31st or before April 1st, they will have a choice of renewing either the old rating, legacy risk rating 1.0, or with the new one, whichever is cheaper. So keep that in mind, that there is that transition period for 6 months for those that are renewing. So let's take a look then at what happens newly identified. So here we have a house that's currently in Zone X, next. And then when the new maps come out, we find that it's in Zone AE. That's a high risk zone. So residents and business owners who are newly identified to be at high risk and have a loan through a federally regulated or insured lender are required to purchase and maintain flood insurance for the life of the loan. Next. With higher risk, property owners will think, oh my gosh, it's going to be more expensive. And the media does as well. And so you should, just like if high risk auto and stuff insurance goes up. Well, what happens is FEMA offers a cost saving option called the newly mapped procedure. And a property owner has to purchase the policy within 12 months after the maps become effective. So let's say they become effective, and I'm just making this up, don't hold me to this, October 2022. So they have until October, just before October 2023, to purchase a policy to take advantage of this newly mapped procedure. And then after that, rates will go up no more than 18% a year on a glide path until they get to full risk rate. So you don't have to, boom, go right to the high risk rates. Residents who don't carry a mortgage, though, are encouraged to financially protect their home with flood insurance because homeowners doesn't typically cover flooding. In addition, for any realtors who may be on the phone or somebody thinking of selling their house, the policy and that rate can be transferred, rating option, newly mapped procedure can be transferred to the new homeowner so they benefit from the rating option. Note that other than the newly mapped procedure, risk rating 2.0 does not use flood zones, as I said on the previous slide, or base flood elevations. So some of you may have heard of that term grandfathering before. And grandfather rating, new policies in risk rating 2.0 starting October 1st no longer can be rated that way. So increases and decreases in the base flood elevation that you'll hear Lynn talk about next that could affect building requirements does not affect insurance premiums. But next, if the new preliminary flood maps show that a property is actually right now at high risk, the owner shouldn't wait to purchase flood insurance because Mother Nature is not going to wait to flood. So what happens if you're no longer identified? And we have many of the properties that are actually no longer going to be identified at high risk. They're now going to be identified as moderate or low risk zones, just as you just saw will happen. When that happens next, that the mandatory purchase requirement goes away. And so you'll get a letter if you're one of them, and you'll get a letter from the lender who says that you're no longer required to have flood insurance. And everybody does the yippee-yi-yay dance and excited, hey, we no longer need it. But that's not what the lender said. The lender said no longer required. And people drop it, but you're still at risk. In fact, in Arizona, 30% of the flood claims are actually in these moderate to low risk areas. So the risk is reduced, it's not removed. The challenge communities and insurance agents and others have is that when this happens, as I said, the federal mandatory purchase goes away, and people then drop their policies. As we know here in Arizona, where it rains, it can flood. So next, what we strongly encourage is to keep your home and contents protected, because there is still a risk under that. So those are two of the changes that are going on, but there are situations where there is no change at all. So residents and business owners don't experience a change. And when map changes and flood insurance are being top of mind, this is a good time for communities, insurance agents, and others, as well as property owners, to talk to their insurance agents and say, hey, I have a policy. Do I have all the right coverage? Am I replacement costs? Because something to keep in mind, most lenders only require the amount of the loan, which is often not at least 80%, which is needed in the flood program to be at replacement cost. And they may not have contents because, again, the lender doesn't require contents coverage. If they do have building coverage, maybe they will only get depreciated value or actual cash value if they don't have it to that. So if they're not covered by flood insurance, this is a great time to talk to the agent and say, hey, what do I need? What's the lowest cost that you can get for me? And they have this rating engine now with Risk Rating 2.0 that is much easier to use to provide them to get that quote. So you're still at risk even though there's not a change. So talk to your insurance agent about what the best option is for you. So let me summarize what those changes is. First of all, if there's an increase in risk, that means you're going from zone X to zone AE on the map that Linda was just showing you. And there's that money saving option called the newly mapped procedure. Next. Then though, there are going to be cases, as we know, where there's a decrease in the risk and going from zone A to zone X. So the risk is reduced, but it is not removed. So we strongly encourage you to keep your coverage. And finally, next, there are those cases where there's no change in risk, and this is an opportunity to say, am I fully covered? Do I have what I need to be protected? Because where it rains in Arizona, it can flood. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn the mic over, so to speak, to Lynn Whitman, who's the director of the Yavapai County Flood Control District. You heard her at the beginning to talk about what the effect of map changes are on building requirements. Lynn?
Yes, thank you very much, Bruce. If we could go to the next slide, please. So while flood insurance rates will no longer be based on the flood zones or the base flood elevations, development regulations will still use the flood zones and the base flood elevations to determine permit requirements. Next, please. So in this situation on the left side, this is a parcel that is going into a higher risk zone, from a low risk zone to a higher risk zone. So on the left side, you can see it's outside of the flood hazard area. If somebody were to come in today with this one, we would not have any floodplain permit requirements. It's not to say we wouldn't have other requirements, but we wouldn't have anything specific to the floodplain. Once these maps become effective, the new structure will be within the high flood hazard area. The structure will be required to be elevated. Potentially, we could require engineering for a foundation design. But it's important to realize we now understand that the structure really will be in the higher risk zone. So while we're not going to be regulating just yet to that standard, we want you to understand, we will walk you through what the new risks are going to be, and there will be other implications on future development if we just regulate to the current standard. Next slide, please. So now this one is the opposite. It's a structure that would be permitted in a current high flood hazard area. If it comes in today, we require the elevation, we require the foundation design possibly, but we know in the future it's going to be in the medium risk zone. Well, because we're in the appeal period, we don't know. Somebody could come forward and say, we don't think these maps are right. We could be looking at something and decide that, something is incorrect. We're still going to be making changes. And so we're still going to go with the current effective maps until we know for sure that everything is as it's going to be. But in the future, if somebody comes in with a structure in the same location, it's going to be a medium flood hazard zone. The floodplain requirements themselves for the high zones will not apply, but we will be making recommendations based on the proximity to the flood hazard area. Next, please. And this is what I was talking about with the future implications. So substantial improvements and substantial damage are a FEMA term. And I want to just go over a few definitions so that everybody understands exactly what I'm talking about. A legal non-conforming structure is a structure that was built to conform to the standards at that time. But then say it was built where there was no floodplain. Now there's a floodplain, there's a high hazard area. If the building were to be built today, it would not meet the current standards. So it's a legal structure, but it's not conforming to the current standards. Substantial improvements are if anybody comes in and they want to do some, they want to build an addition, they want to rehab it, they want to, improve some things to the structure. If the cost of those improvements is 50% or greater than the value of the home at that time, that is considered a substantial improvement. Next, please. Substantial damage is similar to substantial improvement, but it's when a structure is damaged, and it could be damaged by anything, not just flooding, but fire or any other kind of disaster. If the structure is damaged and bringing it to its previous state costs equal or more than 50% of the value of the structure, and that's the value of the structure before the damage was done, that is considered substantial damage. And so the rule for it is if the improvements cost 50% or more, the entire structure must be brought into compliance. And the exception is if it's an existing violation or a safety hazard or historic structures. But if somebody were to come in, as we talked earlier, and it's not currently in a floodplain, but we know that it will be, and they don't build it up to the new standards, this is something that they'll have to deal with in the future. They may be limited in what else they can do with that structure. Next slide, please. Substantial improvements do also have to meet the new requirements. So if you add an addition, that addition will have to be elevated and meet the requirements of the new ordinance. Next, please. So the mapping study timeline. Right now, we are at the open house. We're about to enter into the appeal period. So regulations are going to be based on the current effective maps. But we are aware what the maps will be, so we will be making recommendations and educating anybody that comes in on what their future mapping will look like. Probably coming up in the spring, we'll receive that letter of final determination that Linda talked about. At that point, all of the appeals have been taken in, they've been reviewed, the maps have been updated and finalized, so we know for sure what the maps are going to look like. At that point, regulations will be based on the more conservative between the effective and the proposed maps. And I think there's one more. Once the maps become effective, we will regulate per those new maps. It'll be 6 months again after the letter of final determination, and the old maps will just be archived to refer back to so that we can determine, a legal non-conforming structure was built per the previous maps. Next, please. And I'm going to throw it back to Bruce. We can't hear you, Bruce.
Thank you. I had to be unmuted there. Thank you. So thank you, Lynn. This next section here brings back to the point about what if you don't disagree with the flood maps, or if you do disagree with the flood maps, you don't agree with them. With the new preliminary maps is released, some of you may not agree with them to say, hey, that's not right. So these next couple slides are just going to walk you through what your different options are. And basically, the first option is a thing called appeals and comments. And I'll get into both of these in a minute, but appeals and comments is a formal process that occurs after the preliminary maps are released, which they have been now, and it goes through a 90-day appeal period, which Lynn just mentioned starts September 29th. The other option, going to the right there, so to speak, is the letter of map change. And that occurs after the map becomes effective, the study in the map. So that'll be sometime next fall. And that's more down to a specific building where you might be really close, and you can say, due to the scale limitations, the special flood hazard area might actually be a moderate to low risk area. So you could file this LOMA. So let's take a look at the appeal period and where these two things occur. So on this timeline slide, right now where the green arrow is our open house, so to speak here. We'd love to do it in person. We typically do, but unfortunately due to times that we're in, we're doing it virtually. Starting at the end of this month, just 7 days from now, a week, will be the beginning of that 90-day appeal period, which you can submit formal appeals and comments, which I'll cover in a minute. Once we receive those and the 90-day appeal is over with, the two counties and community, City of Sedona, along with FEMA, will review and resolve anything that's submitted. And once they're all resolved, they then issue the letter of final determination, which is next to that beige area that's highlighted. As Lynn pointed out, there's a 6-month compliance period, and then the maps become effective. Now, that is when, once they're effective, you can, for your specific property, submit a letter of map change. And what that literally is a letter from FEMA, if they agree with it, that will be assigned to the map. Actually, these days with digital maps, it actually would be a point that's put on there that you could click on, and it pulls up the letter of map change and take you out of the floodplain, so to speak. You're still at flood risk, which then, the mandatory purchase requirement that I talked about earlier will no longer apply. Again, we still encourage flood insurance, but it's just not required on that. So let's take a look specifically at the appeal and comment period. So when a preliminary flood map is released, FEMA provides for a 90-day appeal and comment period whenever there's new or revised base flood elevations, a flood hazards or floodway boundaries change. So this is an opportunity for property owners, developers, and others to submit an appeal, which is evidence on why they feel their property has been improperly mapped into a zone A or AE. As indicated on the screen, an appeal requires detailed analysis and must be scientifically or technically based. So you just can't say, it hasn't flooded in a while anymore. That doesn't cover it. You can submit next a comment, which is basically a simple correction like, hey, the road location is name or location is wrong, or the corporate limits have changed, etc. So it's not something that is appealable, but is basically correcting perhaps something on the map on that. So let's talk about then, how do we resolve or appeal those comments? So FEMA is going to, as I mentioned, along with the communities here, evaluate the data. And if they say, hey, we need some more information, didn't give us enough. And then once it's reviewed, they'll issue a appeal resolution letter to the county, or copy to the county, as well as to all the appellants, the people who filed the appeal. If it's they agree and say, okay, yeah, we got to make changes, they'll make changes to the preliminary flood map. And then when it's all resolved, they'll issue that letter of final determination to each of the communities saying, okay, folks, the maps are going to be effective in 6 months on that. So that's going to be the resolution of the appeals and comments. But then let's jump and talk about what about your specific property. You don't want to go through all that technical scientific appeal, but you know it's close, you feel that it's out. So this is a situation where you can file a letter of map change, and it's where the building is situated on natural high ground above the base flood elevation. And just because I told about the scale limitations, it may have inadvertently put into zone A. But you have to wait till the map becomes effective. And so when they do, the property owners can submit the proper paperwork and survey information to request a letter of map amendment shown on the left side, or a letter of map revision based on fill, or LOMAR F, shown on the right side of the schematic. This letter removes the federal mandatory purchase requirement as mentioned when that LOMA becomes effective, or LOMAR F. However, I can't say this enough, and Lynn will say this as well, and Linda, is that the flood risk has not been removed, it's just reduced. What has been removed is the federal mandatory purchase requirement. So you're encouraged to consider to carry flood insurance. And as I mentioned, that statistic that just screams out there that more than 30%, that's basically 1 out of every 3 flood claims in Arizona come from these areas of moderate to low risk. So let me flip this back over to Lynn, who's going to talk about one last time the timeline and then some valuable resources that are out there for you if you want to learn more. Lynn?
Thank you, Bruce. So I think we've said a few times now that the next step is the public review, appeal, and comment periods. We've got 90 days. If you do have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to me at Yavapai County. There are contacts at Coconino County and in Sedona. Those will all be on the next slide. We're happy to help you with that process. We can submit them all together at the same time. If you do decide after the maps have gone effective that you want to go the LOMA route to see if you can get your property, just your structure mapped outside of the floodplain, that's something that we can help you with as well. So here are all of our contacts. I do see that there's a question asking if there will be a link available for this recorded webinar. There will be. This will be on our YouTube channel, and we'll share it in all of our social media and also on the project webpage. So with that, that's the only question that I see. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to type them in and we will get them answered. I do appreciate everybody being here tonight. I know it's a lot of information. You can always contact us later as well with any questions. We're happy to answer them. I don't see any other questions coming. Oh, wait. I can't quite get it.
It is
Something about the TDM.
I am a civil engineer. How do I get a copy of the technical data notebook?
If you email me directly, I can get that to you. That's lynn.whitman@yavapiaz.gov. Let me know exactly what you're looking for in there and I'll get it to you.
There was a question on about sharing the link to the recorded webinar. And we can't do that link until we upload it. However, I believe we have your contact information as an attendee, so we can send it out to you.
I can just see the very bottom of the questions. I just see great. I don't know why that is.
If you have hover your cursor over the very last line, you can scroll through them. We'll hang on the line here for a couple more minutes to see if anyone is busily typing in a question.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank the panel for all the really great information. Everyone is welcome to reach out at any time. The appeal period starts on the 29th. We have 90 days. And from there, we'll be putting the maps together. FEMA will, not us. And we will continue to put out information to the public as things change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for FEMA for jumping on with us. Appreciate it.
For sure.
It's my pleasure.